So the 2025 NFL draft is really not that far away if you guys think about where we're kind of at with both the college football season and the NFL season. Plus, we got a big report that's kind of coming out. I guess it's not a report, it's really an article coming out by ESPN. And they're essentially ranking the top 13 quarterbacks for the 2025 NFL draft. And I'm excited for this one, man. If you guys have not followed the NFL draft, let me just catch you guys up. This quarterback class is the best quarterback class over the last 10 years, in my opinion. There's so much depth across the board. There's so many great prospects that are coming out. And I'm excited for it, man. If you need a quarterback, this is a great class to ultimately draft that quarterback. And the crazy thing is we're also at this point in the NFL where most teams have a quarterback. I think there's probably like 2 teams that really need a quarterback, and then there's probably like 4 teams that have aging quarterbacks. And there's maybe like 2 other teams that could potentially take a quarterback. But the fact that we have like 13 guys that could easily, by the time the year comes to an end, could be like top 64 picks, right? We literally have a ton of these guys. And we're going to break it down. So obviously this list here comes from ESPN, Jordan Reed specifically. Again, if you guys have followed the draft long enough, ESPN's the best and most reliable place for this coverage. Mel Kiper is obviously a legit insider when it comes to the NFL draft. And of course, Jordan Reed, the guy that essentially put this list out, works directly hand to hand with Mel Kiper. So if these guys are putting this list out, this is probably what teams think. And the first quarterback on the list is Shedeur Sanders. I love Shedeur Sanders, man. I'm going to show you guys some of this guy's advanced stats really quickly. One of the things I really like with Sanders is the fact that this guy has 17 touchdowns this season to only 4 interceptions. And that ratio is what you want to see when you're looking at guys kind of coming out. But more than that, there's a lot of pressure on Sanders. And I don't think people recognize this. And I'm going to also put up some tape so you guys can kind of see some of these plays here. We'll just look at all of these different completions. So one of the things people don't realize with Sanders is there's a lot of pressure on this kid, right? Because of the fact that, this guy is the son of Coach Prime 1. Coach Prime went to, I think it was Jackson State, and then eventually to Colorado. There's pressure on this kid to have success because of his father, essentially. Not for him, but for the program as a whole. On top of that, every team that plays Colorado wants to beat the shit out of Colorado because they'll say, hey, this team's a little overhyped or whatever it is, right? And the thing is when you put all those things together, right, when you really consider what Shedeur Sanders has to kind of go through, it makes you recognize that this guy has played with a lot of pressure. This guy has essentially... And I would say this, he's excelled this year, right? The guy's had a really, really good season. And I know it hasn't been perfect. They obviously lost to Kansas State just the other day. It was a pretty close game, but obviously they weren't able to get it done. But the one thing you got to realize is Kansas State as a roster is probably better than Colorado at this point. And Shedeur Sanders gave the lead to Colorado, right? With like 2 minutes and 30 seconds left. And the defense couldn't essentially get the stop, right? And you can't put that on Sanders, right? You can't put that on him. That's on the defense for not being able to step up and essentially get it done. Another thing you have to know with a guy like Shedeur Sanders is when you look at this guy from an actual tape perspective, the guy's very, very solid. He can play within structure, but he can also make plays. And we got to recognize the guy doesn't have that good of an offensive line, right? Right away, I think the biggest issue that Colorado has is their offensive line's not very good. And Jordan Seaton, the starting left tackle of Colorado, I think he's going to be a great player down the line. But he isn't that today, right? He isn't a great offensive lineman today. And I shouldn't even say great, right? But the fact that he's a freshman freshman tackle, very first year in college, he has struggles, and he'll continue to have struggles. And that's just kind of what you expect with a guy like Seaton, a guy coming out. Now, I think he'll be a great tackle. I think he's an NFL caliber player. But he isn't that today, and we have to recognize those things, right? So Shedeur Sanders currently ranked the number 1 quarterback. I agree with it. He's my number 1 ranked quarterback as well. I don't know why I have this tape playing. It's pretty pointless, to be honest, so we won't do that for the rest of the guys. But I will look at some of the stats. There was one guy specifically where the stats really stood out to me. But yeah, I love Shedeur Sanders. I think he's going to be the best quarterback out of this class, or at least I think he'll be the first quarterback. I do think the number 2 quarterback on Jordan Reed's list here, Cam Ward, I think he has the potential to actually become really, really, really good as well. Cam Ward, I think this year has taken a step up. And maybe it's the fact that it's a new school with a new coach and everything's a little bit different. And he's come in with a lot of experience. I think he's in year 5 of his college career. This guy's taking the next step, right? He's done everything you want to see from a quarterback, a guy that could be a top 5 pick. Some people compare him to this year's version of Jayden Daniels. Although I will say the one thing Jayden Daniels had that Cam Ward doesn't necessarily have is 2 wide receivers that are first round picks. A guy that's a top 5 pick in Malik Neighbors, and then of course Brian Thomas ended up with the Jags in the first round as well. Cam Ward doesn't have that type of talent, but I do think Cam Ward as a quarterback is very talented. And I watched some of his tape as well. We won't actually watch that here, but if you guys want to see some awards tape, you guys let me know. I have access to this platform here, which definitely allows you to watch every single quarterback, every single game, every single pass. I do want to say one thing I noticed with Cam Ward. The guy's never thrown an underthrown pass this season. He has 0 underthrows, which just kind of tells you about that arm this guy has, right? It tells you about how great of an arm this guy has. And the other thing with Cam Ward, I think people got to recognize is, as a quarterback going from college to the NFL, experience matters a lot, right? The more you play, the better you'll be when that time comes. A guy like Miller Moss has looked really good this year as well for USC, but he's inexperienced. First year starting this year. Now, he's ranked on this list, but keep in mind, I don't actually think Miller Moss comes out this year. I think he'll end up going back, essentially, and then maybe he'll come out the following year. I think that'll actually be the best thing for him, because I think he has like top 5 potential. I'm not sure if he'll get to that at this point. USC has some losses, obviously, but I do like Miller Moss a lot. I just think he should, develop a little bit more, have that experience. A guy like Cam Ward has experience in although he's number 2 on this list, for me, he's 1A, 1B with Shedeur Sanders. Love Cam Ward, love the arm, love the talent, great playmaker, right? Obviously, everybody knows about that electric playmaking ability that this guy has. And let's read what Jordan Reed has to say a little bit, right? So Reed saying where does Cam Ward excel? He says nearly every year there's a transfer quarterback who makes a leap in his development with his new team and rises up the draft boards. The recent examples are Joe Burrow and Jayden Daniels, who turned big seasons as LSU into being top 2 picks. And then for the 2025 class, Ward, who has moved from Incarnate Ward to Washington State to Miami over 5 seasons, is the top candidate. Ward has thrown 20 touchdown passes for 2,200 yards and 5 interceptions through 6 games. The Hurricanes were off over the weekend, but he still is tied for FBS lead in touchdowns thrown. And then he went on to say that Ward is an electrifying playmaker who has ignited Miami's entire program, leading the team to a 6-0 start. He can throw from multiple arm slots and generate velocity with ease, no matter the positioning of his body. Similar to a shortstop maneuvering the infield, his 91.8 total QBR ranks 3rd in the country, and his 20 completions of 20-plus air yards ranks 1st. I'm obviously sick, so I apologize. My reading comprehension is obviously not there right now. Cam Ward gets ranked 2nd. I agree with that. I think 1A, 1B with Shedeur Sanders. And then you got Carson Beck ranked 3rd. I will say this with Carson Beck. He was ranked the number 1 quarterback initially coming into this season, and he just hasn't looked like he looked last year. And that's going to be expected, right? Carson Beck came into last year with guys like Brock Bowers. He had McConkley, the guy that ended up with the Chargers, I think, in the 2nd round. When you factor those things in, Carson Beck downgraded on the offensive side. He's also lost Tate Ratledge, who's the best guard in the country. And that's impacted Georgia a little bit. Now, of course, Georgia's still a great football team. And I will also say this, Carson Beck against Alabama, as an example, was the type of tape you wanted to see, right? Because that's essentially a top school against a top school. It's the best competition that Beck will probably play this year, although Georgia does play Texas here coming up. But Carson Beck, to me, although he wasn't great to start the year, definitely looked good at certain parts. And although he wasn't great to start against Alabama, he had a really, really good second quarter, right, half the second quarter, and then the second half as well, right? He brought Georgia all the way back, and they even took the lead against Alabama for one play, that is. And then to me, Carson Beck's kind of a wild card, right? Because some team might say, hey, we like what this guy showed last year on tape. His team got a little bit worse. And then I think as we go into next season, maybe they feel like, hey, this guy could potentially get back to form. And we'll take him maybe with the 23rd overall pick, right? Depending on where the Miami Dolphins pick. You never know, right? The Dolphins could potentially take a quarterback. I like Carson Beck, like what he's kind of shown as a quarterback. 3, I would probably put that as a little high. I don't actually rank Carson Beck as 3. The guy I like more than Beck is going to be the fourth quarterback, according to Jordan Reed, which is going to be Jalen Milroe. I'm very high on Milroe, right? Very, very high on Milroe. I think the one thing we got to recognize with quarterbacks is experience. Cam Ward's now in his fifth year in college, and he's played all 5 years. He's been a starting quarterback since his freshman year. Jalen Milroe just took over last year, right? I think this is his third year as well, right? So, you're looking at a guy that was a true freshman, started in his second season, and I don't think he was ever redshirted, right? So I don't know if he played in his freshman year, but he didn't start, right? And then essentially last year, which was his sophomore year, that was his first year starting. And now he's a junior, and he's looked really, really good as well. And I'd even make the argument that Jalen Milroe could easily be the number 1 overall pick. I would make that argument. I put Sanders and Ward as 1A, 1B. I'd probably put Milroe as 1C. And the thing with Milroe is he's kind of the biggest wild card in terms of projecting where he's going to end up ranking because of the fact that, he's had a really good year for Alabama this year. And he wasn't really that good last year. Right? Let's just be honest. He really wasn't that good last year. But the guy is very solid when it comes to passing. He's very good. Very solid when it comes to being a quarterback. He's very solid when it comes to playing within structure. And I think that's the big thing with a guy like Jalen Milroe, right? If you get this guy paired up with a guy like Bobby Slowick, right? Maybe Slowick ends up taking a job with the Raiders or whatever team it ends up being. If you pair up a guy like Bobby Slowick, or maybe it's Ben Johnson, who becomes the head coach of a team as well, and you get him a quarterback like Jalen Milroe who plays within structure, I think he could be a really, really good quarterback. Underthrows, overthrows, only 9 combined, right? And what people don't recognize with underthrows and overthrows is, as a scout, one of the things that teams really, really value that I've recognized with quarterbacks. And again, I'm not a quarterback evaluator by any means. My primary job has always been O-line and D-line. But one of the things that I've picked up in some of these meetings that I've been in is with quarterbacks, although ball placement is one of those things that's a little overlooked, is not it's not valued very high. Overthrows and underthrows are one of those things where you can recognize with the guy that, hey, if this guy has, let's say like 12 underthrows, that could be an indicator that he's not, he might not have the arm talent. He might not have the power to push the ball downfield. And if you don't have a good arm, teams aren't going to draft you, right? If you're a quarterback that can only throw the ball 40 yards, putting, everything underneath it, you're not going to get drafted in the NFL. You have to have a big arm. You have to be able to throw the ball 50, 55, 60 yards downfield. To me, one of the things you got to recognize is underthrows is one of those things you really have to keep in mind. You can overthrow. That's not an issue at all. In fact, Cam Ward has so many overthrows as opposed to underthrows. And I think that's one of the things that teams also like with a guy like Cam Ward. Milroe, of course, you guys can see, only has 2 underthrows. Really not a big deal. He does have 3 throwaways. I think throwaways is another thing that always kind of factor in. Cam Ward has 8 throwaways. I don't know what the number is for Shedeur Sanders, but throwaways is always an important stat as well, because as a quarterback, are you making the smart decision to throw the ball away, or are you throwing an interception? Right? I feel like one of the things I've noticed with the guy like Miller Moss this year a little bit is he doesn't throw the ball away much, right? He's gonna fit the ball in there. It could be, this much space. He's gonna try to fit the ball in, right? And it's another thing to just kind of keep in mind, right? So to me, you gotta factor in, is a guy not able to put enough ball, enough velocity under that pass? Is he not able to get enough power under? Is he not able to push it far enough downfield? And then, of course, decision making is always another big part of it. I think Jalen Milroe has the most upside in this draft. I would not be surprised at all if he ends up being the best quarterback from this class. The guy's strong, has a really, really good arm as well. He's athletic. He can make plays. But the best part is he can play within structure, right? And he's given Alabama, he's basically kept Alabama in every single game or won every single game, essentially, right? I think they have 1 loss. But the guy's been very solid. Number 4 ranking according to Jordan Reed. We'll go through some of these other guys a little bit faster. Quin Edwards gets ranked number 5. I like Edwards. I'm just not 100% sure if I agree with it. Now, I do think there's a chance we're gonna get like 6 quarterbacks to go in the first round. But with that, what's gonna end up happening is there's gonna be teams that are gonna be in the playoffs that are gonna end up drafting quarterbacks. I would be shocked to see the Dolphins not draft the quarterback. I'd be very, very shocked. All right, because although Tua's a good quarterback, when he's healthy, the health part of it is a big deal. for me at least, and I feel like Mike McDaniel has to recognize that you're going to get fired if you have another situation where, let's just be honest, right? Mike McDaniel's a great coach, but if you're not able to make that decision, if you don't realize that, hey, our quarterback's always hurt, and now I'm not able to win playoff games or, compete for a Super Bowl, you're going to get fired at some point, right? I wouldn't be surprised if a team like the Dolphins take a quarterback. The Steelers will probably make the playoffs. They're probably going to take a quarterback as well. The Jets are another team that'll probably take a quarterback. The Falcons have a quarterback, so I don't see them taking a quarterback. There's probably a couple other teams with aging quarterbacks that'll probably take a quarterback, right? The Raiders are obviously going to take a quarterback as well. The Cowboys are another team that, Cowboys might end up just picking top 15, unfortunately. But they might also take a quarterback in this class. And the great thing is there's a lot of them, right? So Quin Edwards, 5, I can agree with it, but I'm not 100% sold on Edwards. I think Texas has had one of the best group of playmakers in the country, right? You can make the argument from a playmaker perspective, there's no one better than Texas. Isaiah Bond's a phenomenal wide receiver. They have a couple of good running backs. And Texas just produces guys, right? Last year, you had a ton of guys that came out of Texas as well. The number 6 ranking was kind of surprising to me, right? Garrett Nosh out of LSU. I don't really see much from this kid to say he's the 6th best quarterback. I will say he's done a pretty good job this year. I do think he should probably stay one more year in college. I feel like he's done a good job at times, but he's also struggled to push the ball, right? I feel like he struggled to push the ball downfield. He struggled to be, one of those guys that you're going to feel like, hey, we fear this guy as a passer. And Jordan Reed has a early to mid day 2 pick, which is kind of interesting, right? That means it's a potential first round pick. I personally like the 7th guy on this list a lot more, and Drew Aller out of Penn State. Aller's a very, very, very good quarterback. I wouldn't be surprised if this guy ends up being the number 1 pick either, right? Aller's one of those guys that just knows how to play the quarterback position. In fact, Jordan Reed says this about Aller. He says, Aller is a well-built pocket passer with the arm strength to fit throws into every window. He has 1,400 passing yards, 11 touchdowns, 4 interceptions this season, and an 87 QBR, ranks 7th in FBS. That's actually kind of interesting. I didn't realize he only had 1,400 yards. It's kind of interesting. He might have ended up getting hurt this year. Don't quote me on that, but very, very surprised to see that's his numbers. I will have to fact check that here. All right, guys, so here's his game log. He might actually have ended up getting hurt. I'm not 100% sure. He only had 17 passes, 20, 21, 21, which is kind of interesting, but he's been pretty consistent, right? Kind of interesting. Not 100% sure what's going on with those stats, but when I watched this guy's tape, and specifically I watched the USC game from this past week, the guy looked really good to me, right? He's pushing the ball, very, very, very good arm, in my opinion, right? That's the one thing I noticed with a guy like Drew Aller. Number 7 here, I think he's another guy that could end up being, a lot higher when that time actually comes. And keep in mind, the college playoff is going to be a big factor into these guys and kind of where they get drafted as well. Right, C.J. Stroud was one of those guys that dominated when he had that game against Georgia. And I think people recognize real quick that if that's the type of tape he can put out there, we need to take this kid. Right, and a lot of teams actually had C.J. Stroud ranked higher than Bryce Young. Unfortunately, the one team that was picking with the number 1 overall pick ended up taking Bryce Young essentially over C.J. Stroud. Right, I know for a fact there are at least 3 or 4 other teams, at least from a grade perspective. Right? I know for a fact that they had specifically C.J. Stroud ranked higher. Which is kind of interesting, right? I know there was a report about the Raiders, although I'm not 100% sure if they actually had him ranked higher. But the Seahawks are a team that actually had him ranked higher. Not that the Seahawks would have taken a quarterback at that time, but interesting nonetheless. You got Jackson Dart at number 8. I think Dart's another guy that's kind of interesting. Although I probably wouldn't have him ranked this high. To me, Dart's probably lower right now than I would say higher. I think Dart's in a really good situation with Ole Miss. They have a great wide receiver over there. And then, of course, you got Lane Kiffin running that high-tempo offense. Dart's kind of done what he's been asked to do, but I'm just not 100% sure if I'm sold on this kid. Miller Moss, USC, is the guy that I'm very, very high on. Of course, he's a redshirt junior this year. I think he should come back next year to really be able to lock himself as a top 5 to top 10 pick. This year, I don't see that happening because there are a lot of other quarterbacks already. The draft this year is also a lot weaker for those of you guys that don't follow the draft. a lot weaker this year than it's been in past years. And a big part of that is because, you look at some of the tackles coming out, 6'4", some guys have arm length less than Rashawn Slater. Some guys are just raw, and then the other guys are just juniors, so they might not even actually come out. If you're a junior, you can't come out unless you graduate college. So, not saying that that's super hard to do for these guys, right? But some of these guys aren't going to come out. I think Miller Moss is a good guy, is a good candidate not to come out, although he will actually be able to graduate. He's a redshirt junior. I don't see Miller Moss going in the third round. I'd be shocked. If he came out and he goes in the third round, I'd be very, very shocked. To me, Miller Moss has major upside. And I know it hasn't been great, but I also think USC, they have a great offensive coordinator. They have a great scheme, not offense coordinator. They have a great head coach that runs the offense. And they have a great scheme around Miller Moss, right? But the thing is I think with a guy like Miller Moss, your weapons, although they have a really, really good wide receiver in Carrion Branch isn't what he is today, which he will be in like a year or two, right? He'll be a lot better as he gets more experience. And I think for Miller Moss, you should stay there for one more year. You never know how many players might end up transferring over, especially once you get guys like Shedeur Sanders to leave Colorado, right? You never know if a guy like Will Shepard or Jimmy Horn end up staying and then transferring to USC, or other guys, right? There's plenty of other really, really talented players in college. If Miller Moss continues to do what he's kind of doing and then he does decide to come out, I wouldn't be surprised if he's one of the top 2 or 3 quarterbacks taken either. I think there's a ton of upside with him. The Indiana quarterback's another guy in Curtis Rourke who I think has some upside, but not 100% sure with him. I'd probably have him at the end of my list. He's ranked 10th. Kyle McCord's another very interesting player. McCord's went to Syracuse and has basically dominated at Syracuse, and it's also kind of interesting because he was at Ohio State last year, and Ohio State was very, very good. I mean, the only game they ended up losing was the final game of the season last year, right? They're undefeated up until that point. And it's interesting that Kyle McCord ended up leaving Ohio State, because I think this year, if he ended up staying there, not saying Will Howard's a bad quarterback for Ohio State, but I think Kyle McCord could have been potentially been better, right? But I'm glad that McCord was able to transfer over to Syracuse. He's done a phenomenal job for Syracuse. Now, I don't expect him to be drafted super high, but I do think that if he ends up, third, fourth round with a team where he can develop, he'll have a good career in the NFL, right? And it might be just as a backup. He might come in and maybe get a shot. We'll see what ends up happening. But generally speaking, I like Kyle McCord as a long-term NFL quarterback. And again, that's not saying he's going to be a superstar caliber. He's going to be a franchise quarterback. I just think he's a good football player. He has a good arm. And you see that with Syracuse, right? He currently has, or at least with Ohio State last year, he had 3,100 yards, 24 touchdowns, and only 6 interceptions. That's pretty damn good, in my opinion, right? And that was to his first year starting with Ohio State, right? This year so far, he has 1,800 yards, 17 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. So again, not terrible. Syracuse does have a really good coach as well, so I think that's kind of helped him out a little bit. Dillon Gabriel's another guy that's kind of interesting coming out of Oregon. I think 12 for Gabriel makes sense, and then you'll see Will Howard is also at the end of this list at 13, and that kind of rounds it up. It's interesting because if Sean McVay, for example, who's probably in the market for a quarterback, really likes a guy like Dillon Gabriel and he drafts him in like the second round, Dillon Gabriel has a chance at that point to be a good NFL quarterback, right? Because Gabriel's one of those guys that, although he just took over for Bo Nix, this is his first year actually being that quarterback for Oregon specifically. I think he's one of those guys that if you put him in a good scheme and system, he can have actual success in the NFL, right? He's a guy that can actually be a good football player. And you see that with Oregon. Oregon struggled a little bit early on, but as time continued to go on, he started having more and more success, and he had a really good game this past week. And I think he's one of those guys, again, that, as long as you let this guy play, as long as you let this guy develop, I think he has some potential, right? Again, first year with Oregon, I don't remember who he was with last year. It might have been Oklahoma. It may have been Arkansas. I think it was Oklahoma. And, again, Dillon Gabriel's a guy that I like, right? We'll see what ends up happening as he kind of gets in the NFL. Will Howard, 13th ranked player on this list. He's another guy that I think has a little bit of upside. Now, a lot of these guys, or let's just be honest, 13 guys, 10, 11 of them will probably end up not ever being good caliber quarterbacks. But I also think a big part of them being good or not is also going to be dependent on the team they ultimately go into, the situation they're in, right? If Will Howard ends up being with Miami, he's more likely to have success as opposed to if he ends up with Luke Getsy, right? We know Luke Getsy's the quarterback killer. The guy can't develop on, he can't install an offense. So situation matters a lot for some of these quarterbacks as well, right? If Bobby Slowick ends up getting his hands on a guy like Cameron Ward, he's gonna be a lot better than if he ends up with whatever other coach that may end up being, right? So again, it really is going to come down to the coach. It's going to depend on where these guys land. And again, 13 quarterbacks on this list. I would say there's probably 9 of these guys that could potentially get into the first round, depending on how they finish this season. And again, I think a lot of these teams drafting quarterbacks are going to be teams that have quarterbacks. They might not necessarily have to move off of the current quarterback that they have, right? There's a lot of these teams. Justin Fields, Russell Wilson might end up being the quarterback for the next 2 years, but the Steelers could easily draft the quarterback as well. I think the Rams probably draft the quarterback unless they're sure Stetson Bennett's the guy, which who knows. The Saints, another team that could potentially draft the quarterback, although Spencer Rattler looked pretty good the other day. But again, this quarterback class is deep, man, and I'm excited to see how it kind of shapes up. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, man. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I do want to get to some film breakdowns. I have Travis Hunter on the list. I have there's a couple of defensive guys, right? There's a guy that Oregon has that I really like as well. So we'll kind of get into some of these film breakdowns as we can kind of get into it. Let me know what you guys think. Thumbs up, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time with another video.